This video combines a whole series of my shorter videos on the string section, so there's a lot of content here. You're going to learn about the string section instruments, how many you'd expect to find, and how they're grouped and laid out in a variety of ensembles, the parts of a string instrument, how they're tuned, played, and create sound, and then I'll talk you through each individual instrument, including its open string tunings, range, and timbre, before I demonstrate all of the string articulations, techniques, and bowing techniques, all demonstrated live by an amazing young violinist called Ziana Harron. And finally, you'll learn about two techniques that allow you to play more notes in the string section, Divisi strings and double stopping. So we have a lot to get through. Let's get stuck in. There are four main instruments in the string family: the violin, viola, violoncello, and contrabass. The violoncello is usually just called a cello, and the contrabass is sometimes called a double bass, in jazz or popular music an upright bass, or simply bass. Quite often the harp is grouped into the string section and usually sits with or behind the strings in a standard orchestral layout. However, in this course, we're only going to focus on the four main string instruments. Generally, all four instruments are built in the same way, with the main difference being the dimensions in terms of width, length, and depth. One thing to also be aware of is that there are smaller versions of each instrument too, such as a 3/4 cello. These are designed mainly for children to learn on, but worth mentioning in case you ever see a tiny cello in a thrift store and wondering what the heck it is. The string family is split into 5 sections: first and second violins, violas, cellos, and contrabasses. When describing the amount of instruments in each section, you often see a series of numbers separated with slashes, like 16, 14, 12, 10, 8, which is 16 first violins, 14 second violins, 12 violas, 10 cellos, and 8 basses. And that's a fairly common setup for a large orchestra: 16, 14, 12, 10, 8. Importantly, for smaller variations, you can't always just half those numbers, as 4 basses aren't literally half as loud as 8. So smaller variations include 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, or 8, 6, 4, 3, 2. In pop music, the basses are often left out as they clash with the bass guitar and make the low end of a mix quite muddy. So a pretty common layout for pop is 6, 6, 4, 4, or 6 first violins, 6 second violins, 4 violas, and 4 cellos. It is possible to go even smaller than this, but you begin to run into problems like the higher ranges of each instrument sounding very weak, and also some intonation or tuning problems. String players aren't always precisely in tune, and they apply vibrato differently to one another. When you have a section of 16 violins, these tiny discrepancies go unnoticed, and in fact they add to the fullness of the sound. However, when you get below 4 or 5 violins, these slight differences become very pronounced and can sound pretty nasty. It's like when two people sing together but not in harmony. It often sounds a bit rough. Of course, there are always exceptions to these rules. Obviously, these problems are eradicated when you get down to just one of each instrument, as in the string quartet, consisting of 2 violins, a viola, and cello. Writing for quartet requires a little more care to ensure parts are balanced and easily performed by a single player. The traditional orchestral layout, and the one most commonly adopted by all sizes of string sections, including quartets, basically goes clockwise from high to low pitch, as if looking at the orchestra from the audience. So first violins would be on the left of the conductor, followed by second violins to the right of them, violas next, basically in front of the conductor, and cellos on the right, with contrabasses behind them. There's also an alternative layout, which, from left to right again, goes first violins, cellos, again with the double basses behind them, violas, and finally second violins. This layout means the 2 violin sections are opposite one another, and the middle and lower range instruments are more central, which when you think about it is a bit closer to how modern songs are mixed, with lower frequencies central and higher ones spread further out. Of course, rules can always be broken, and composers are always finding new ways to bring different textures to their pieces. Hans Zimmer is a particular advocate of interesting recording layouts. If you're ever fortunate enough to have your string parts performed by actual players and not just sample libraries, think carefully about how you'd like the players to sit and create your own seating plan. Do bear in mind though that if you're not conducting yourself, the conductor you're hiring might be used to a standard layout, in which case it's best to play it safe and stick with one of the 2 traditional arrangements, unless you have time and money to burn. From top to bottom, the parts of a string instrument are called the scroll, peg box, tuning pegs, neck, fingerboard, upper bout, waist, F-holes, bridge, lower bout, fine tuners, tailpiece, and on violins and violas, the chin rest. String instruments are tuned using the tuning pegs. The string is held in place at the bottom of the instrument in the tailpiece and then wraps around the tuning pegs at the opposite end. By turning the pegs and therefore tightening or loosening the string, the tuning of the string changes, just like when you wrap an elastic band around your fingers and pluck it. The tighter you stretch it, the higher the pitch, and vice versa. Where the string is held in place at the tailpiece, the instruments also have fine tuners. These give the players much more accuracy when it comes to tuning. The strings are under so much tension that even the slightest of lengthening or shortening can change the pitch dramatically, so the fine tuners are essential for getting the instrument perfectly in tune. If you've ever played a guitar with a Floyd Rose system, the fine tuners will be familiar to you. The fingerboard is where the player places their finger in order to quickly change the note, and that's called stopping the string, as where the finger is placed physically stops the string at that length. Again, unlike a fretted guitar, the placement of the finger is absolutely vital. String instruments don't have frets, which means if you were to slide your finger up the string while bowing, you'd have a continual change of pitch. Frets on guitars basically stop the string at perfect half-step or semitone intervals. That's not the case with string instruments. This is why beginner string players often sound out of tune, as they've not yet mastered finger placement and the listening skills required to make the minute adjustments. The F-holes are there to help project the sound. When the string is bowed and vibrates, which is what creates the sound, that vibration is transferred through the bridge to the hollow body of the instrument. Then the sound is amplified from the F-holes. Again, to relate it to guitar, if you strum an electric guitar without amplification, you get barely any sound. It's similar when bowing a violin with no hollow body, such as an electric violin. The sound is much quieter, although not as quiet as an electric guitar with no amplification. And then there's the bow, which consists of the tip, bow stick, bow hair made from around 150 to 200 hairs, a grip made up of winding and a pad, the frog, and the screw to tighten or loosen the bow. Players use something called rosin to give the bow hairs the ideal amount of friction on the string. Rosin's basically a solidified resin made often from pine trees. The bow hairs themselves are usually made from hairs taken from the tail of a horse. The bows used to bow across the strings, which are made from either steel, a synthetic material similar to nylon called perlon, or gut, which is literally the fibre found in the intestines or gut of animals, typically sheep. One thing that's very important to remember is that the strings aren't all perfectly lined up like they are on a guitar, as that would make bowing an individual string impossible. The bridge and fingerboard are actually curved, which is why when you see string players bowing the instrument, they have to raise the bow higher or lower, or outwards and inwards in the case of cello and bass, to hit each string individually. Thanks for watching so far. If you're finding the video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more music composition, production, and industry tips. These videos are actually part of a free string orchestration course that I offer. If you'd like to sign up, check out the link in the description. The violin is the smallest of the string family. Like all of the string instruments, it has 4 strings and they're tuned from low to high to G2, D3, A3, and E4. That makes the lowest note of a violin in standard tuning G2. When it comes to the highest note, things get a little less defined. The highest note of any string instrument depends a lot on the individual instrument and how it's built, as well as the ability of the player. Ability is a big factor in how clearly the higher notes can be played. Most professional orchestral players should be able to play up to around E6. But if you're composing with or for sample libraries, remember that many of them actually limit the highest playable notes to somewhere around C6. Realistically, the extreme high range of each instrument should be avoided on all of the string family instruments unless it's being used for a particular effect, like a thin, strained, or really piercing sound. Violin parts are written in treble clef at concert pitch, so no need to mess around with transposing. In fact, all of the string instruments are in concert pitch. The violin has a bright and brilliant timbre, in which the range can be in the high range, particularly piercing. That said, string instruments are capable of a huge amount of different timbres, which we'll discuss in a different video. Often the viola is the most overlooked of the string instruments. To the general public, it just looks like a violin, so they have no way of telling them apart, unlike the cello and contrabass, which have quite obvious differences. Sadly, Even composers often just use the viola to plug the gaps in their orchestrations, leading to a lot of boring or even awkward parts. Learning about the viola's characteristics will help you understand how best to play to its strengths. The viola is tuned 1/5 below the violin, so standard tuning from low to high is C2, G2, D3, and A3. So the lowest note is C2 up to a height of around G5. Again, some models and players will be able to get even higher, but some sample libraries are often limited to around D5 at the highest. Most viola parts are written in the alto clef, which might be another reason why composers don't like writing for viola. We're terrified of the alto and tenor clef. If the part is in the higher register for an extended period of time, then treble clef can also be used. Viola players can easily read both clefs, but try to avoid too many ledger lines. No one likes reading ledger lines. In terms of timbre, the viola is similar to the violin, but a bit darker, making it more stately or mellow. It's also sometimes said to be a bit more nasally than the violin too. The cello is tuned 1 octave below the viola and is often regarded as one of the most beautiful sounding and emotive string instruments. Perhaps because it's less piercing than the violin, but just as expressive. From low to high, its tuning is C1, G1, D2, and A2. Since it has a longer fingerboard, the cello's range is quite a lot larger than its smaller siblings too. From C1, it can stretch all the way up to C5, a full 4 octaves. Cello parts are written in the bass clef, unless, like with the viola, there are extended sections in the higher register, in which case the tenor clef can be used to avoid too many ledger lines. The timbre of the cello could be described as full, warm, and sonorous, similar to a male chest voice. Guitarists and bassists may finally see something familiar here. The tuning of the double bass is the same as the bass guitar or first 4 strings of the electric guitar. The only member of the string family to be tuned in fourths rather than fifths. So it goes E0, A0, D1, G1. Many modern orchestral double basses have what's called a C extension. A C extension is basically an extended fingerboard that extends above the peg box for just the low E string. They usually have a series of stops that allow the string to be locked chromatically on any note between C0 and E0. The extension allows the range of the double bass to be extended down to C0, with its highest practical note being G2. Without the extension, the lowest note is E0, so bear in mind that if you'll be writing for live instruments, extensions are not always available, or at the very least, you'll need to give notice and specify that you'll be needing extensions. Double bass parts are written in the bass clef, and sometimes the tenor clef if the part's written in the higher range. It has a heavier sound than the cello, with a full, deep, dark, penetrating timbre. Unlike the other instruments in the string family, the contrabass isn't often used as a solo part, although there are some notable examples. Despite its size, it's very, very nimble, but its lower range means fast passages can sound muddy or dark and lack clarity. We're going to look at the various techniques that are available on string instruments. Pretty much all of these techniques are playable on all 4 instruments, but will have different tonal qualities to them depending on which instrument is playing them. I've also enlisted the help of an amazing violinist, Ziana Harron, who's going to demonstrate each technique and articulation for you. If you want to know more about Ziana, I've added a link to her Facebook page as a resource. Even if you deal exclusively with sample libraries and have no intention of ever writing for real instruments, this section is still massively important. It's going to help you understand all of the various articulations that come with sample libraries. And the more you understand them, the better you'll be able to write for them, and the more realistic and interesting you'll be able to make your pieces sound. It's going to open up a whole new world of timbres and sounds for you to get your teeth stuck into. Articulation is all about how a note is played and how notes begin and end. We'll start by looking at articulations that are common across all instruments, not just strings, before moving into the more string-specific ones. Tenuto is often described as playing a note to its full value. In practice, the actual result of marking something as tenuto tends to give the note a very subtle accent, like a slightly forced sound. Staccato is translated as detached, which is a much better way to think of it than short. It means that each note should be detached from the next. Staccatissimo basically means extremely detached. Again, in practice, it's often interpreted to mean to play the note as short as possible. The hairpin accent, or marcato, means to play the note with force. So the note is emphasized, beginning more forcefully. Marcatissimo or martellato is kind of like a combination of a marcato accent and a staccatissimo. In strings, martellato is actually a bowing technique that's used to play marcatissimo notes. Okay, now let's look at some more advanced or string-specific articulations. Starting with détaché. As the name implies, détaché means to play the notes detached. Our next technique, legato, is the opposite. Legato means that notes are fluidly joined together. That sometimes means a group of notes played in a single bow stroke, but legato can also be played by bowing back and forth in a smooth motion. Next up is portato. When you see this notated, you'll realize it's a combination of legato and staccato, which sounds completely conflicting. So let me try and explain it in a simpler way. It's legato, but with each note slightly emphasized. If you watch a string player playing portato, you'll see that the bow almost pauses for a moment as each note is played. Not in a jolty way, as that would create a detached sound, but in a smooth, bouncy kind of way. The next two articulations we're looking at have a lot of crossover: portamento and glissando. Unlike a guitar, the string instruments don't have marked frets. When you place your finger on the fretboard of a guitar, the string's actually being stopped by the piece of metal that runs perpendicular to the fretboard, the fret. Violins, cellos, violas, double basses don't have these frets, they're fretless. So when you slide your finger up or down the fretboard of one of these instruments, you get a continuous change of pitch, not perfect semitones. Using these slides in between notes is portamento or glissando. So portamento is when you slide to or from one single note, whereas glissando is where you slide from one note to another note. And finally, vibrato. A string player will naturally perform with vibrato unless you instruct them not to. And most good sample libraries include non-vibrato patches too. It gives a drier, slightly colder sound than a warm, full vibrato. There are many different ways that a string player can bow their instrument, and each way creates a slightly different tone. Learning these bowing techniques will help you find new textures to exploit in your compositions. You can use bowing directions to your advantage. Say you want a more aggressive, slightly more powerful sound for each note, you could instruct the players to use down bowing, which is naturally more powerful than an up bow to get that effect. There are also a few ways to tell string players which part of the bow to use. You could write WB for whole bow, MB for middle bow, UH for upper half, or LH for lower half. Some more terms that indicate bow placement are testa or punta d'arco, which is to play with the very tip of the bow and it creates a very thin, light sound. Altolone, meaning to play by the frog of the bow and gives a slightly cumbersome, powerful sound. Both of those terms are to do with the whereabouts on the bow the player should play, but you can also change the tone of string instruments by changing where on the string the bow is placed. Sul tasto means to play the bow higher up the string over the fingerboard and gives a softer, less bodied sound. Sometimes this is referred to as flautando, as it's closer to the tone of a flute. The opposite of sul tasto is sul ponticello, which means to play closer to the bridge of the instrument. This gives a glassy, scratchy sound, which can actually be really unpleasant if not performed well. And finally, not quite a bowing technique, but it is something that affects the tone of a string instrument, and that's con sordino, or with mute. String instruments are designed to resonate. They have big, hollow bodies with those F-holes that amplify that vibration out. The mute clips onto the bridge and prevents it from vibrating so much, but it also changes the tone of the instrument, giving it a darker sound with less harmonics or upper frequencies ringing through. There's a great example of mute in Sibelius's Tapiola, where the string players each remove their mutes one by one while holding a tremolo on one note, so the texture just slowly changes over time. I hope you're finding this compilation of videos helpful so far. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you are, and if you want to sign up to my free string orchestration course, just follow the link in the description. This final section on techniques groups together a few of the more string-specific techniques that didn't really fit so well into the more specific categories. Let's start with spiccato. Spiccato is a very short sound, much like staccato, but the main thing that differentiates it is that between each note the bow should bounce off the string, whereas for staccato, the bow should remain on the string. A kind of extreme version of spiccato is ricochet or jete bowing. This is where you literally let the bow ricochet or bounce multiple times off the string in the same bowing direction. Pizzicato, or pizz for short, is where the string is plucked rather than bowed. There's also an extreme version of pizzicato called either snap pizz or the Bartók pizz, named after the composer most famously associated with it. You might have heard harmonics played on the guitar, where the guitarist lightly touches the string while plucking a note and it creates a beautiful, high-pitched ringing sound. Well, harmonics are also a feature of our string instruments, but they don't always sound pretty. The natural way is just like the guitar. You lightly touch the string while bowing. An artificial harmonic is created when the player stops a note, so they press firmly down on the string as if to play it normally, and then with a second finger they touch the string very lightly a fourth above the note, which creates a sound 2 octaves above the original stopped note. Another technique you may want to consider is sul G, or sul whatever string you want. This means that all of the notes should be played on only one string. Okay, now something that can be a bit confusing: trills and tremolo. By definition, a tremolo is a trembling sound. A single note tremolo on a string instrument is where the player bows very quickly back and forth to create that trembling sound. The second form of a tremolo is the fingered tremolo, where the player alternates between 2 notes in a single bow stroke, not the fast back and forth bowing as in a bowed tremolo. This is where the overlap with trill comes in, and where there's some confusion. A trill is also the rapid movement between 2 notes, usually the note a half or full tone above the written note. Next up is bariolage, which is possibly one of the more impressive sounding techniques, as it sounds like a lot of notes being played very quickly. It's actually more of a bowing technique than a fast finger technique. Usually using an open string as a root, the bow moves quickly across a number of strings, giving a fast arpeggiated sound. Collegno is a really great technique for adding a percussive texture to your parts. There are two forms of collegno, but normally if you don't specify which, it's assumed to be collegno battuto, which is where the player turns the bow upside down and literally hits the strings with the wooden part of the bow. The other form of collegno is collegno tratto, which is where the strings are bowed with the wooden side of the bow. Our final two techniques are kind of traditional and modern equivalents of each other, colle and chopping, or chunking as it's sometimes called. This is where the bow quickly lands on the string and then kind of chips away, giving a short, gritty, quite percussive sound. In colle, the traditional method, the note itself is a little more pronounced, whereas in chopping, sometimes the note is completely muted and you just get a percussive wood chopping kind of sound, as the name implies. If there are 4 string instruments split into 5 parts, first and second violins, violas, cellos and basses, then surely that means the biggest chord you can have is a 5-note chord, right? 1 note per section. Well, no. There are a couple of ways of creating fuller chords with more notes, namely divisi and double stopping. Now, again, if you're never planning to work with a full orchestra and doing all of this with samples, you might be wondering why you need to worry about this. It's all about realism. If you load up a sample library patch that has 18 violins and you play a 3-note chord with those violins, the sample library doesn't automatically split those 18 violins into 3 groups of 6. It plays 18 violins on each note, 54 violins in total. Okay, let's start with double stops. A double stop is when the player plays 2 notes at once. The reason it's called a double stop is because usually 2 fingers are used to stop 2 separate strings. You can have double stops, triple stops, and even quadruple stops, where all 4 strings are played to form a chord. Importantly though, it's only really the double stop where notes can be played at a variety of dynamics simultaneously. Because the bridge of string instruments is curved, the bow can only play across 2 strings at a time, unless you push down extremely hard on the strings, in which case you can sometimes play 3 at once. That means triple stops can be played as a single chord on violin and viola, but expect it to be loud. Quadruple stops will always be arpeggiated from bottom to top, so bear in mind that you won't get a solid attack with quadruple stops. Quite often with orchestras, even if you direct them to play double stops, they'll still actually play divisi. And I'll explain what divisi is in a moment. There are a few reasons why they avoid double stops. Namely that they're harder to play in tune, since the player has to get 2 notes in tune at the same time. They're harder to make sound as tonally full, and finally, getting in and out of a double stop isn't always easy unless it's been very well planned by the composer. Now, divisi. As you might have guessed from my hints, divisi is where a chord is split across the section. So if you have a 2-note chord in your violin part, half of the violins will play 1 note, while the other half play the second. Incidentally, for a 2-note chord, the players will split per desk, which means per stand. Usually, 2 players share 1 music stand, so the default is that the player closest to the audience plays the top note, while the player on the inside, further from the audience, plays the lower note. Very broadly speaking, try to avoid having the first violins divide unless you really need the extra notes. Put any high register dividing on the second violins. Also avoid divisi in the basses other than for octaves, or if you're really trying to create a low, muddy, crunchy sound. Don't expect to hear each note clearly though. Thanks for watching. If this video helped you, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit the big red subscribe button for more music composition, production and industry tips. If you want to learn more about the string section, sign up to my free email video course by following the link in the description. And finally, let me know what else you'd like to learn about by leaving me a comment.